I'm going to be talking to Jeffrey Dvorkin, University of Toronto journalism professor, about the Friday arrest of two freelance journalists, Amber Bracken and documentary filmmaker Michael Toledano. So welcome to the interview, Jeffrey.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Look, what's your take on this? This has generated a lot of outrage in the media community, a lot of outrage amongst folks who are supportive of the Wet'suwet'en and anti-pipeline. But what's your take?
Well, my sense is that the police have an unpleasant tradition in this country, often of interfering with what journalists do in the legitimate pursuit of their job. And there has always been, going back to my days as a manager at both at CBC and at National Public Radio in the States, the police want more information that they can get out of journalists. And it's very important for journalists to understand that they do not act as police agents, and that their job is quite different from that of the police. When the police interfere with the legitimate procedures of news gathering, that's when journalists have to say, this cannot go on. Cops have the job to do, journalists have a job to do, and frequently, especially as we're seeing out on the West Coast, they come into conflict. And the details of that conflict are still unclear. Maybe when they show up in court, some of these things will be clarified. But right now, it seems, from what I'm reading in the media, these journalists were basically just doing a job of reporting, and the police tried to stop them from doing that.
Now, as an independent journalist, this immediately occurs to me because you've talked about, back in the day when the police overreached, the CBC would threaten legal action or maybe even take them to court. But the Amber Bracken was working for the Narwhal, which is another independent entity, and the independent filmmaker, I'm sure, is not doesn't have bountiful resources to threaten legal action. I mean, if I was in that situation, I couldn't threaten legal action. I couldn't afford to pay the lawyer. And does that give the police in these kinds of instances, when we have more independent journalists, a leverage they didn't have back in the day when they were, butting heads with a well-resourced media organization like the CBC?
I think that's exactly the problem, is that in a digital era that we are in, when it comes to journalism and news gathering, there are more freelancers or people who are acting as freelancers than ever before. They're doing podcasts, they're doing Zooms and videos and all that sort of thing. And they don't have the legal department of the CBC or the Toronto Star behind them. And I think the police are must be very well aware of this. And so they feel that they are able to intimidate freelance journalists more effectively. And I think it's incumbent on the rest of us to say, no, you can't intimidate these journalists. They're just doing their job.
Yeah, I would agree. And one of the things that comes to mind, okay, so there's an injunction against the protest. Okay, so the police felt that they were within their rights to go in and remove the protesters. And their rationale for arresting the journalists was they didn't identify, apparently there was a 60-minute conversation between the police and the protesters, and the police then broke down the door to this site. And it was only later they say that the two identified themselves as journalists. Well, at that point in the game, I would argue that they should have let them go. There was no need to arrest them at that point, and yet they did, and they took them. They kept them for 3 days in custody, and they were released by a judge on Monday. That seems to me that they could have exercised and should have exercised that discretion.
I agree, and I think this is part of the fog of digital journalism, is that when journalists go out into an event without being apparently identified as belonging to a larger and apparently more powerful media organization, these young journalists, and they are mostly young because we older guys don't have the legs for this anymore, they really should be given the resources before they start. I think the Canadian Association of Journalists has a very good training course for freelancers in these situations, how to identify yourself, what to do if the police try to put pressure on you. There's some really good strategy and tactics that these freelancers must learn, and it's up to journalism professors and the Canadian Association of Journalists to help inculcate this.
So that's great. We don't know yet, I guess, how Bracken and Toledano comported themselves during this, whether they gave the police any grounds to arrest them. But by the same token, maybe we should put the onus on the RCMP, public pressure, political pressure on the RCMP to change its approach in this and to be more respectful of independent journalists.
Well, good luck with that. I'm not sure that the police, as far as I have had interactions with them as a manager, care very much about that. I mean, maybe in the States, frankly, there's more of an acknowledgement of the First Amendment obligations inside the media culture. And I was really, when I lived in Washington, D.C., I was impressed with how respectful people were about the role of the press and the role of the media. I don't think Canadians are as well imbued with those ideas. So I think it's up to the rest of us to help educate both the public and the police as to what the appropriate roles are, especially, I mean, with video cams and iPhones and people taking pictures, it is less clear about who's on which side, and I think that becomes part of the problem.
Well, we've seen in especially during the Trump presidency, we saw outright attacks on the legitimacy of the media, a very deliberate attempt to delegitimize news organizations. And can we put this event in Canada within that context? Are we seeing some of that creep up into Canada?
Oh gosh, I hope not. But it probably is happening in a certain way. There is overall a general suspicion, a growing suspicion, I believe, inside the culture against large institutions, whether they are media institutions, academic, universities, churches, certainly governments, where the public feels that it has every right to express its concerns and complaints. Whereas a generation ago, there was a little more acknowledgement of the role of these large organizations. I think the digital culture is breaking that down. That may not entirely be a good thing or a bad thing, but it is happening.
Now, you're seeing younger journalists come into your classrooms and into the newsrooms of these organizations, and they have a different view of how to conduct themselves, how to do journalism. Can you talk about that, please?
Right. I think what's happened is that there is this younger generation, this younger cohort of journalists everywhere, because media organizations said we got to hire younger, better, smarter replacements for us old white guys. And they've done that to a large extent. CBC has done it, the Toronto Star has done that. But the complication is that they've now institutionalized a generation gap inside their own organizations. And these younger journalists are saying, well, why are we doing it the old way? And why aren't our ideas appreciated or acknowledged or acted on? And the older journalists, of which I consider myself one of them, say, well, look, you've got to prove you've got what it takes. You've got to do sort of these awful assignments. You have to work shift work and overnights and prove yourself, and let's see what your writing is like. And it's an apprenticeship. Journalism is not a profession. It is a tradecraft, in my opinion. So that means that unlike going to med school or law school, you come out and you say, well, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer. When you come out of journalism school, you're not a journalist until you've done it, until you've proven that you've mastered the craft, as it were. And I think that there's an impatience there. These younger journalists who I think are amazing and smart and impatient, and impatience is a really good quality. They're saying to their older managers, well, why are we doing it this way? Why won't you listen to what ideas I have? And so what we saw recently at the Toronto Star, when during the election, they had editorial board meetings with the party leaders. And when Maxime Bernier from the People's Party of Canada was invited, there was a walkout. Younger journalists would not attend that meeting. And they said that the Toronto Star should not be giving Maxime Bernier this oxygen of publicity. And this created quite a difficulty, to say the least, inside the editorial ranks of the Toronto Star. And I think that the older generation has a point. If you are unwilling to encounter ideas or people with whom you may disagree, that kind of limits your ability to report. And I think that was the issue that the older editors said, you know, you've got to handle these difficult ideas.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I remember back to my first, in the late 80s, my first newspaper job. And you know, I was reporting for about 6 months, and I had proven that I could write and report. And the managing editor said, well, why don't you write a column? You know, because I'd proven my chops. But by the same token, what the situation you just described reminds me so much of the 60s. And you and I were around back then. We remember what happened. The young people just said, we're not putting up with these ideas. We're not putting up with this culture, and we want something different. And we will walk out, and we will sit in, and we will do these kinds of things. And I see both sides in this argument, frankly.
Well, you and I are cut from, I think, a bit of the same cloth. I like the idea that these kids are getting jobs, going into news organizations and saying, let's change it. But they also have to learn patience, and that's going to be that's the toughest part of the demand of journalism. And they will have these encounters with older managers, and the older managers, the good ones, and there still are quite a few of them around, will say, okay, let's listen to them. So I'll give you another example. One of my students whose family came from Uganda got a job with cbc.ca. And his manager, an older white guy, said, okay, I want you to go on YouTube, find something vaguely Canadian, write some copy around it, we'll put it up on the CBC website. And my student said, well, why don't we do the same job, but do it our way? And he was dismissed. He wasn't fired or anything, but his supervisor said, we don't do it that way. We leave that to, and he named another broadcaster, which I won't name. And it was just, he came to me, my student came to me and he said, why are they like that? And I said, part of it is the digital culture has hollowed out news organizations. They don't have the intellectual bandwidth to give you the time and space to do that story in a better way. And I think that's going to be another challenge, is that as impatient as these young people are, these organizations understand that they are not as resourced as they once were. So there's going to be some compromise and conflict.
Well, this is, now you're getting into my turf a little bit, because as an independent journalist, I often do stories that in different stories in a different way than traditional news organizations might approach them. And it's because I have the freedom to do that. I can push the boundaries a little bit. I can, and so on. And I don't know that we'll ever get away from that. I mean, institutions will act as institutions will. And a newspaper or a CBC will have standards, it will have history, it will have culture. And I understand why, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that tension is something that we should celebrate instead of, rather than try to resolve.
I think that's my ideal as well, that there will be a creative tension inside news organizations that may allow for both concepts of journalism to coexist. But we all have to, as they say, can't we all just get along? And I think to do that in a way that serves the audience in a really effective contextual way is the name of the game right now.
Well, Jeffrey, apparently we can't all get along. Thank you very much for this. I really appreciate your insights.
My pleasure, anytime.